Mark Sykes was 36 years old when he drew the line that created the modern Middle East. He drew it in London, using a grease pencil on a map, describing it afterward as running from the E in Acre to the last K in Kirkuk. François Georges-Picot, his French counterpart, had never visited most of the territory he was dividing. Between them, in May 1916, they produced borders that have never been accepted as legitimate by the populations living within them, and that have generated more sustained violent conflict than any other borders drawn in the 20th century. The series borders drawn in bad faith begins here. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was secret. Both Britain and France understood that publicizing an agreement to divide Arab territories between themselves, while simultaneously promising Arab leaders independence in exchange for military cooperation against the Ottomans, would collapse the Arab Revolt they depended on. The hypocrisy was operational. Arab fighters were dying for a British promise that British diplomats were simultaneously negotiating away. When the Bolsheviks published the agreement in November 1917 after seizing Russia's imperial archives, the betrayal became public. Lawrence of Arabia, who had led the Arab Revolt believing the independence promise was genuine, called it a stunning disgrace. He was right. The series begins with the most consequential act of colonial bad faith in modern history. Britain made 3 simultaneous and mutually incompatible promises about the same territory during WWI. The first, the Hussein McMahon Correspondence of 1915, letters between British High Commissioner Henry McMahon and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, promising British support for Arab independence in exchange for the Arab Revolt against the Ottomans. The second, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the secret treaty dividing the same territories between Britain and France, with no Arab independence. The third, the Balfour Declaration of November 1917, a letter from Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, pledging British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. 3 promises, 3 incompatible visions for one territory. 1 century of conflict. The Balfour Declaration's specific language was chosen with deliberate ambiguity. The pledge was for a national home for the Jewish people, not a state, not sovereignty, not a defined territory. The clause protecting existing populations was explicit. Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The non-Jewish communities of Palestine at the time constituted approximately 90% of the population. The declaration promised a homeland to one group while pledging not to prejudice the rights of the 90% who already lived there. It was a promise designed to be read differently by each of its intended audiences. The conflict between those readings has not been resolved in 2026. The Sykes-Picot line's specific problem was not merely that it was drawn by outsiders. It was drawn without reference to the geographic, ethnic, tribal, or religious realities that had organized life in the region for centuries. The line divided the Kurds, historically concentrated in the mountain border zones between Anatolia, Persia, and Mesopotamia, between 4 future states, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. None of these states would give the Kurds their own territory. The line placed Shia majority populations under Sunni minority governance in Iraq. It created Lebanon with a sectarian power-sharing system built around a 1932 census that was outdated within decades. Every ethnic and sectarian conflict in the modern Middle East has a direct line back to borders that ignored the people they were dividing. The Iraq that Sykes-Picot created was the most internally contradictory state in the new Middle East. The British had merged 3 former Ottoman provinces, Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, and Basra in the south, into a single state. Mosul was predominantly Kurdish. Baghdad was predominantly Sunni Arab. Basra was predominantly Shia Arab. The 3 communities had different languages, different religious practices, different relationships to Ottoman authority, and no shared political tradition that would make a single state coherent. Britain installed a Hashemite monarch, King Faisal, who had never been to Iraq, and called it a nation. The 2003 American invasion and its aftermath were not a product of recent policy failure alone. They were the predictable consequence of a state that should never have been created in this form. The Lebanese sectarian system, directly designed by France as its Sykes-Picot inheritance, produced the most structurally unstable state in the modern Middle East. France drew Lebanon's borders specifically to include a Christian Maronite majority at its 1920 founding, incorporating territory that extended Lebanon's area and diluted the Christian proportion simultaneously. By the 1940s, the population balance had shifted. By the 1970s, a demographic reality fundamentally different from the 1932 census, on which the sectarian power-sharing system was based, had produced the conditions for civil war. Lebanon's civil war lasted 15 years, killed approximately 150,000 people, and produced the specific Hezbollah-Iranian-Syrian axis, whose consequences are still active in 2026. The Iraq-Kuwait border, which Saddam Hussein crossed in August 1990, triggering the Gulf War, is a direct Sykes-Picot consequence. Kuwait was detached from the Ottoman province of Basra by Britain in 1913 and maintained as a separate British protectorate specifically to control its Gulf access. Iraq's claim that Kuwait was historically part of Basra province, and therefore of Iraq, was factually coherent within the Ottoman administrative framework that preceded Sykes-Picot. The border between them was a British administrative line, not a historic or geographic boundary. The Gulf War was, at one level, a conflict over whether a colonial border had the legitimacy to override the Ottoman administrative geography it replaced. The international community said yes. Saddam disagreed. 500,000 troops were deployed to enforce the Greece Pencil Line. Syria is the most complete expression of the Sykes-Picot Agreement's failure. France received Syria under the agreement and divided it into smaller units. Greater Lebanon, the state of Aleppo, the state of Damascus, and the Alawite state, specifically to prevent a unified Arab political entity that might resist French control. The division was later partially reversed, but the sectarian geography France created, with Alawites in the coastal mountains, Sunnis in the cities, Druze in the south, Kurds in the northeast, became the demographic landscape that Assad's Alawite minority government exploited to maintain power. The Syrian civil war of 2011 was the moment that demographic landscape produced its inevitable political crisis. 500,000 dead, 13 million displaced. The Sykes-Picot borders, still on the map. The Islamic State's 2014 declaration that it was abolishing the Sykes-Picot borders and restoring the historic caliphate was ideologically coherent within the specific framework of the border's illegitimacy. ISIS was a genocidal organization whose methods were barbaric and whose ideology was a perversion of Islamic thought. But its specific claim that the borders of Iraq and Syria had been drawn by colonial powers without legitimacy was historically accurate. The most destructive terrorist organization of the 21st century built its founding narrative on a documented colonial betrayal. That is not an argument for ISIS. It is an argument for taking seriously the specific grievance that colonial borders create, before those grievances are exploited by the most extreme actors available. The Middle East that Sykes and Picot divided was not a blank space waiting for borders. It was a sophisticated civilization with ancient cities, complex trade networks, diverse communities, and layered identities that had coexisted, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully, for centuries under Ottoman administration. Damascus was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Aleppo's souk was the greatest trading bazaar of the medieval Islamic world. Baghdad had been the center of the Abbasid Caliphate and the House of Wisdom. Jerusalem was sacred to 3 world religions. These were not empty territories to be distributed between European powers. They were the homeland of tens of millions of people who were not consulted about their distribution. The Palestinian population that the Balfour Declaration described as existing non-Jewish communities, whose civil and religious rights were not to be prejudiced, had a specific name, a specific culture, a specific agricultural civilization, and a specific relationship to the land that predated the British Mandate, the Ottoman Empire and the Crusades. The deliberate use of non-Jewish communities, rather than Palestinians or Arabs, in the Balfour Declaration was not accidental. It described the existing majority population in the passive negative, defined by what they were not, rather than in the positive assertion of who they were. The language of the Declaration contains, in miniature, the specific dehumanization that would characterize how their case was treated for the following century. Every significant Middle Eastern conflict active in 2026 has a direct territorial or demographic connection to the Sykes-Picot framework. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Balfour Declaration, is Sykes-Picot's third document. The Lebanese political crisis, the sectarian system, is France's Sykes-Picot inheritance. The Syrian reconstruction question. The borders that produced the civil war are still the borders of the reconstruction. The Kurdish political question, across Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, is the direct consequence of the people divided between 4 states with 1 grease pencil. The Iraqi political instability is the direct consequence of 3 Ottoman provinces that should never have been merged, forced into a single state by British administrative convenience. The Middle East of 2026 is the Middle East of 1916, still living in the same borders. The specific lesson Sykes-Picot teaches, and that this series will trace across 6 borders, is that territorial illegitimacy is not an abstraction. It is a generator of sustained violence that compounds across generations until the underlying legitimacy question is addressed, or the conflict exhausts the populations living within it. The borders of the modern Middle East have produced over a century of sustained conflict without resolution, because the question of their legitimacy was never resolved, only suppressed by colonial power, then by Cold War client-state arrangements, then by regional authoritarian governments that have now largely collapsed. What remains? The borders, the populations divided by them, and the century of grievance that the grease pencil line created. The series continues next episode with the Durand Line. Mark Sykes died in 1919 of influenza at the Paris Peace Conference where the post-war settlement was being finalized. He was 39 years old. He did not live to see the consequences of his grease pencil line. François Georges-Picot lived until 1951, long enough to see the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the first of the conflicts his agreement helped create. Neither man was held accountable for what they produced. Neither man's name is widely known outside specialist historical circles. The agreement that bears their names produced the borders that have generated over a century of sustained violent conflict affecting hundreds of millions of people. The grease pencil line outlasted both of them by more than a century. It is still on the map. 2 men, 1 map, 1 grease pencil line, the modern Middle East. 110 years of sustained conflict in the borders they drew. The series continues next episode with the Durand Line. The border Henry Mortimer Durand drew through the Pashtun homeland in 19,893, dividing a people between what would become Afghanistan and Pakistan, creating the specific territorial dispute that neither country has ever formally resolved, and that has made the Afghanistan-Pakistan border the most dangerous ungoverned space on Earth. The Durand Line is why the Taliban uses Pakistani territory. It is why drone strikes happen in Waziristan. It is why American forces spent 20 years in Afghanistan without resolving the border problem that preceded their arrival by a century. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. Borders Drawn in Bad Faith continues. 6 borders, 6 episodes, 6 active conflicts in 2026, whose origins trace to specific moments when specific people drew specific lines through lands they did not understand and populations they did not consult. The series has begun, the borders are still there.